There was a period in my life when I believed clarity was something you earn through effort. Not effort in a dramatic sense, but steady, constant pressure. The kind that comes from staying busy, staying focused, and staying ahead of uncertainty. I believed that if I kept moving, clarity would eventually meet me where I was. If I stayed engaged long enough, if I thought carefully enough, if I didn't allow myself to slow down, I believed answers came to people who refused to stop searching for them. So I searched constantly. Every question that surfaced in my mind felt like something that needed to be resolved quickly. Unanswered questions made me uneasy. They felt like loose ends, signs that I wasn't being decisive enough, or disciplined enough, or intentional enough. I didn't like leaving things open. I wanted resolution. I wanted direction. I wanted to know what the next step was before I reached it. So the moment uncertainty appeared, I leaned into it with effort. I analyzed it. I thought through every possible angle. I replayed conversations. I imagined outcomes. I made lists in my head and mentally reorganized them over and over again. At first, it felt productive. There was a sense of control that came from staying mentally engaged, from always having something to work through, from believing that clarity was just one more thought away. But slowly, almost without me noticing, the quality of my thinking began to change. The thoughts became heavier, less precise. They circled instead of progressed. I would return to the same questions day after day, hoping that repetition would eventually produce certainty. It never did. Instead, the more I pushed for clarity, the more distant it felt. What I didn't understand at the time was that I wasn't really seeking understanding. I was trying to escape discomfort. Uncertainty made me restless. It created a sense of vulnerability I didn't know how to sit with. So I tried to outrun it. I filled the space with activity, with planning, with thinking, with movement. Anything that made it feel like progress was being made, even if nothing was actually becoming clearer. I told myself that slowing down would be irresponsible, that pausing meant losing momentum, that waiting would cost me something I wouldn't be able to get back. Stillness felt risky, so even when things felt unclear, I moved forward anyway. I made decisions because it felt better to choose than to wait. I committed to directions that seemed reasonable on the surface, even when something underneath felt unsettled. I told myself that confidence would come later, that clarity would arrive once I proved my commitment. Sometimes it did. More often it didn't. There was a quiet pattern forming that I didn't want to acknowledge. The decisions I rushed tended to move things forward externally, but they left something unresolved internally. A subtle tension lingered, a sense that something hadn't fully aligned. I learned to live with that feeling. I treated it as normal, as the cost of being productive, as proof that I was doing something rather than standing still. But the feeling didn't go away. It followed me from one decision to the next, from one plan to the next, always quiet, always present. What I didn't recognize then was that clarity doesn't respond well to pressure. It doesn't arrive because you demand it. It doesn't appear simply because you refuse to rest. It doesn't reward urgency. It waits, and I didn't know how to wait. I believed that unanswered questions were problems to be solved immediately. That leaving things unresolved meant I was falling behind or failing to act decisively. So I kept pushing. I tried to force answers out of situations that weren't ready to speak yet. I tried to understand things before they had fully unfolded. I tried to resolve questions before enough information had quietly revealed itself. And every time I did, the result was the same. Movement without peace. Decisions without ease. Progress that felt slightly misaligned. I wanted clarity on my terms quickly, decisively, and without interruption. But clarity didn't seem interested in meeting me there. What I couldn't see at the time was that clarity often withdraws when it's chased. Not because it's unavailable, but because it arrives differently than effort expects. Quietly, gradually, without announcing itself. And as long as I kept demanding answers instead of making space for them, I wasn't able to hear what was already forming beneath the noise. The shift didn't arrive the way I expected it to. There was no breakthrough moment, no sudden realization, no clear line where everything finally made sense. It happened quietly in the absence of effort. I reached a point where I was tired of circling the same thoughts without gaining anything new from them. Not exhausted in a dramatic way, but gently worn down by repetition. The questions were still there, but the urgency around them had softened. For the first time, I stopped trying to extract an answer. Not because the questions no longer mattered, but because I finally accepted that forcing them wasn't helping. I let them sit without demanding resolution. I allowed myself to move through my days without constantly revisiting them. That was unfamiliar territory. I had always believed that unanswered questions required attention, that leaving them alone meant neglecting something important. But this time, instead of tightening my focus, I loosened it. I didn't push the questions away. I simply stopped pressing them, and something subtle began to change. The tension I had been carrying started to ease. Without the pressure to decide, my thoughts became lighter, less crowded. I wasn't trying to understand everything at once anymore. I was just paying attention. There were small moments when things felt clearer, not in words, but in feeling. Certain options felt heavy when I imagined them. Others felt open, even if they were uncertain. I noticed what drained my energy and what quietly restored it. None of this came as a complete answer. It came as signals. At first, I didn't trust them. They seemed too subtle, too incomplete. I was used to clarity feeling definitive, not tentative. But the longer I stayed with that quiet awareness, the more consistent it became. I began to recognize that clarity doesn't always arrive as a solution. Sometimes it arrives as an alignment, a sense of what no longer fits, a quiet understanding of what feels wrong before fully knowing what feels right. And that was enough. Days passed, then weeks. The questions didn't disappear, but they changed. They no longer demanded attention. They waited patiently in the background, unfolding slowly as new information revealed itself naturally. What surprised me most was how little effort it required. I wasn't trying to think my way into clarity anymore. I wasn't revisiting the same scenarios or rehearsing outcomes. I wasn't pressuring myself to decide before I was ready. I was allowing understanding to form at its own pace. And when clarity finally arrived, it didn't announce itself. It didn't feel dramatic. It didn't feel urgent. It didn't feel like an achievement. It felt settled. There was no internal debate, no need to justify it to myself. The answer didn't need reinforcement because it wasn't competing with doubt. It simply felt right. That was when I understood something I hadn't before. Clarity doesn't come from effort alone. And it doesn't always come from thinking harder. Sometimes it comes from restraint, from knowing when to pause instead of push, from recognizing when additional effort only adds noise, from trusting that not knowing, for a time, isn't a failure, but a necessary stage of understanding. Waiting, I realized, isn't passive when it's done, honestly. It's attentive. It's a willingness to listen without demanding immediate results, to allow questions to mature instead of rushing them into premature answers. I still value decisiveness. I still believe action matters, but I've learned to recognize the difference between action that comes from clarity and action that comes from discomfort with uncertainty. They feel very different. One feels forced. The other feels grounded. Now, when I notice urgency tightening my thoughts, I pause. Not to escape the question, but to see whether it's ready to be answered yet. And when there is calm, not certainty, but calm, I know clarity is close. It doesn't mean every decision becomes easy. It means fewer decisions feel misaligned. Fewer choices leave behind that quiet residue of doubt. The answers that arrive this way tend to last. I learned this later than I should have, but once I did, it changed how I listen, how I decide, and how I wait.